Well, good morning to all of you, and welcome to the panel on social protection. Unfortunately, Josefina Vázquez Mota had to cancel her presentation, but we have the honor of having Mr. Gabriel Martinez talking here with us. Before, let me introduce you to Alicia Menendez, who will be facilitating the conversation with Mr. Martinez. Mrs. Menendez is an associate professor at the Harris School and a principal research scientist at the National Opinion Research Center. Her research is mainly focused on public health, poverty, and inequality in Latin America and South Africa, and she received her PhD in economics from Boston University. So I will hand it over to Professor Menendez.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Bienvenidos a todos. As Jorge was saying, we had this cancellation from Josefina. It's a pity, but it's also an advantage because now we have time to hear Gabriel more time, develop his ideas, ask a lot of questions, so very good. Let me introduce Dr. Gabriel Martinez to you. Dr. Martinez is the Secretary General for the Inter-American Conference on Social Security. The Inter-American Conference on Social Security is an international organization that was established in 1942 to effectively foster cooperation among social insurance and social security administrations and institutions in America. Previously, Dr. Martinez was the Director of Planning and Finance at the Instituto Mexicano of Seguro Social, Social Insurance Institute in Mexico. He also coordinated the Economic Deregulation Unit at the Secretary of Commerce in Mexico as well. Gabriel is also a professor, is an academic as well, at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, that's ITAM, you probably know ITAM. He has taught lots of courses there, some of them price theory, labor economics, econometrics, just a few of them. He has also published several books, among them, The Regulación Económica en México, that focuses on economic reforms that happen in Mexico. He also has 3 books about social security reforms in the country. And he is the editor of the book Pobreza and Política Social, Poverty and Social Policy. Dr. Martinez has his BA in economics from ITAM, and he's one of our own because his PhD is from the University in Economics from the University of Chicago. So, welcome, Gabriel.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I think the first panel we had was extraordinary with these two personalities that have been really influential people. And when I received the invitation to participate in this forum, well, obviously the first thing I saw was that the topic is success stories from Latin America. And so I began to think, what defines a success story in Latin America or anywhere? Why, on these issues of social policy, do we have an experience that can be called a success story? Now, to answer that question, I wrote this slide that has an opinion on, well, a way to measure the success of policies, of ideas. And the first thing to say is that really economists, and in my opinion, and social scientists in general, really don't have any special knowledge on what's virtuous, what's the good way to live, what's ethical, how much income should be redistributed. And also, in this opinion, it is said that the ethical imperative to have a massive redistribution of income perhaps inhibited the development of a positive theory of the distribution of income. And by the late 70s, the early 80s, human capital theory was already part of the core curriculum and knowledge in the social science. But still, if you look back at, say, the 1970s, or even the 80s, I'd say to a large extent even the 90s, topics such as the economics of the pension system, of health insurance, really were not that important in the literature. Perhaps you could find a few references in very specialized journals. But in general, it was not a significant issue, even when by then the states were already redistributing a lot of money through social policy. And by a positive theory, we mean that if we have some hypothesis, some idea, some verification on how the tax code and inheritances and education and technology, how those things happening in society affect the distribution of income, then perhaps we can think about how policy also affects the distribution of income. And since the 80s, perhaps that issue has picked up steam. We have much more research now. I think we're still very far from having good enough theories on many important issues. But knowledge is cumulative now. This opinion is based also on that focusing the problem of redistribution as a purely ethical problem really makes it difficult for social scientists to differentiate themselves from other agents in society. Why should economists or sociologists or historians have better ethical views than anybody else? It's not clear that they have any advantage in that. And, well, perhaps some of you already distinguished that this was an opinion that George Stigler expressed sometime around the 80s. And, he would make frequent reference to the philosophy of science and the sociology of science, how ideas compete, and how sometimes when there are the right incentives, some ideas flourish. That's why he also has, it's a common hypothesis in the sociology of science. Discoveries sometimes are simultaneous. Several people discover the same thing at the same time. You know, in the telecom industry, Gray and Bell patented the phone the same day. What are the odds of that? But it happens when some conditions happen. Well, same in politics, same in economics. There's competition in ideas. Some ideas are good and progress. Sometimes, still would say, ideas succeed without opposition. There's no body of knowledge competing. There are no interest groups opposed to the idea. A new idea comes and it triumphs. Sometimes it's not that way. Sometimes a new idea has to go against established interest. There are other ideas that sound good and that seem to be better solutions. So it takes time for the new ideas to take hold. So I'm going to very briefly use that framework to talk a little bit about social policy in Latin America. I'm going to go very, very quickly, like in 3 minutes, over what has happened with the labor market, because I think it's one of the main frameworks that we have to apply social policy. And well, it's a very quick review, but briefly, in the last 20 years, we have a steady growth of employment, but the Great Recession has had an impact. We have wages that have been plain. Very few countries have a significant increase in wages, and it has to do with productivity. We really don't have a great history of productivity improvements in the region in the last 20 years. Unemployment is lower. It was in general higher in the 90s. It became lower in the 2000s, and even with the Great Recession, no one in the Americas has gone as bad as as France or Spain or these countries with rates of 15 or 20% again. Formality, which is a big issue in social policy. Formality here means people who pay taxes and pay social security contributions and have regular access to health insurance, to the pension system. It's slightly better, but basically plain. Okay, the last 20 years we don't see a very large improvement. We have lower extreme poverty indexes, but still with very large inequality. And perhaps with the exception of a country or two, we still see levels of extreme poverty that are pretty high, in the order of 50 or 60% or more sometimes. And one thing that also changes very little in the region is the gap across ethnicities. Really, the integration of Indian groups in places like Mexico or Guatemala or Bolivia, really, you don't see much of a change there. I have graphs on all this issue. I'm not really going to go over these. Just some very brief comments to stress the point. The issue of employment actually was pretty good in North America in the 90s, you know, the Clinton years, the boom and NAFTA. Then with Bush, it didn't go too bad, but not too well. And really, the Great Recession has hit Mexico, Canada, and the US. Unemployment rates are relatively low. In South America, that's not the case. They have kept high employment rates even after the recession. On the issue of informality, I was telling you that the evidence shows that indicators are plain. You have some improvements. For example, Chile or Uruguay have been successful in reducing informality, but they still have many people outside of the system. Wages are flat. Have some variation with the business cycle, some variation with real exchange rates, but basically wages are flat for the last 15 or 20 years. Obviously, some countries that were in deep recessions or in deep monetary crisis may have big changes, but when you look at the long run, it's basically flat, and that's because productivity has been flat also. And same in North America, that's Canada and the US. That cycle is just a visual trick. The band is between +3 and -3%. So Canada and the US wages are also pretty much flat for the last couple of decades. On poverty, we have a decline. I put this graph just to give you some visual aid. We have a decline, but look, I mean, you still have places like Bolivia where, I mean, this is 60%, so there's a decline, but the level of people in extreme poverty is still pretty high. Mexico is where? Mexico is here. Also, very slight decline. Perhaps the big story here would be Brazil. Brazil really has a big fall. I'd say that's the only big, consistent case of fall in these extreme poverty measurements. And it has a lot to do with social policy, I believe. Then unemployment, you got basically lower unemployment. Even with the Great Recession, you don't get a big increase. You get some, for example, in the US, Canada, Mexico had a little bit of unemployment with the Great Recession, but still, I mean, you're talking, for example, countries like Brazil, Argentina were coming from the 90s from higher levels of unemployment. So that was a very quick trip through the basics of the labor markets in the region. And then we get into this discussion of what has been working, what not. And I think the best way to think about it is not as a national history. I think it's better to think it as how specific ideas have been implemented and have been or have not been successful in solving problems. And there, I think we find the commonalities. For example, with the pension system, we had very substantial reforms in the 80s, the 90s. There's still a debate on this, but very often the debate goes on financial issues, on the return of funds, on the relation between taxes and benefits, which are important issues in their context. But I'm going to talk now about what I believe is really the fundamental issue in these reforms. And what these reforms do is that they realize that Social Security performs two functions. On one hand, Social Security is a state guarantee of income for orphans, for widows, for people in old age who has contributed a minimum of time, for disabled persons. And that's one thing Social Security does. And the other thing Social Security does is to manage a life annuity program, or a life annuity market, if you want. And the way Social Security was founded in the Americas, the U.S. system is from 32, the Mexican from 43. And really, the national pension system mostly come from those years, 30s, 40s. And Social Security was found performing the two functions, to provide the guarantee of income and to provide and to operate as a monopoly in the market for life annuities. And these reforms broke that up, and now states provide the guarantee, and you have a more decentralized system in the affiliation of people, in the management of funds. Now, I believe this is an important view because when you look at, let's call them unreformed countries, like, for example, the United States or Brazil, what you see is that they're doing things that also break up the monopoly in life annuities of Social Security. The United States, for example, has a big debate on the privatization or following the Chilean model in Social Security. It has not happened. And probably it's never going to happen because Social Security provides a basic, well-managed system. Replacement rates are relatively low compared with Europe. And what the government has been doing since the 80s is to reform the tax code, to reform the financial industry, to facilitate the development of private pensions. And today in the United States, the money going to the private pension system is bigger than the money going to Social Security. And you have this big institutional change. For example, corporations move to either these plans where you have individual savings accounts, like the IRAs, the 401ks, that kind of stuff. And corporations also have this thing they call the cash balance plans, which are sort of individual account managed internally by the corporation. And you go to places like, for example, Norway and Sweden and Germany, and it has happened also. They have kept a basic Social Security program that provides a lower benefit, and they have opened up the door for more competition and more decentralization in the rest of the pension market. I think when you look at it that way, you understand also why this idea has been successful. It's successful because it breaks up a public monopoly, and there are ways to keep the state guarantee for widows and for orphans, and there's I believe wide agreement in any society on that. Really, I mentioned in a previous slide the issue of extensive redistribution of income. Well, there you have an example. And I think almost anywhere I would agree in that, for example, the state has to do something to guarantee that orphans have some money to live and to eat, and same for widows and the disabled. So there's no disagreement on having that redistribution. But we have this big change on how to organize the system, and we have a useful explanation on how the incentives of the government change. And I think that explains why we see that movement going on in the world. Now, health insurance is a different story. Again, countries have similar problems. Health insurance is often tied to a job, and sometimes when people retire, or when they change a job, or when they're unemployed, or when they marry, they have to change insurers, or they lose coverage. And all countries have to deal with that. And this is, in Stigler's language, this is one of the cases where the struggle has been long. It's not been easy for governments to convince society of what their goal is. Societies, citizens, voters, do not understand very well what governments are trying to do with health insurance. In the U.S., well, you just had the Obama reform. There was the Clinton attempt for a reform. From this point of view, I wonder how many people understand what's going on with those reforms. And I'm not saying that they're good or bad, but they're difficult. It's difficult to explain. They require a lot of regulation. And that makes for a long struggle. It takes time for governments to explain these, to set up the regulations. Still, I believe we see a movement for health. I don't really say social health insurance because there's very little private health insurance around the world, with a few exceptions like the United States. But usually you have strong participation of the state in health insurance. And well, that's another strand of reform. Now I'd like to mention programs for families. And here even the name tells you that, something's going on the way governments look at it and how the ideas have advanced or stagnated. There's a type of program that began to be applied in a massive scale in the 90s, I'd say in the late 90s, and people call them the conditioned cash transfer programs. And basically these are programs that give money to families, and then the family is conditioned to go to school or to go to some medical attentions. And that's an idea that became very successful very quickly. And less than 10 years after, I don't know if all, but most of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean had some sort of cash transfer programs. Cash transfers obviously are an old staple in social programs, the family allowances, and they have different names around the world, but some public program giving money to families is not new. What was new here was to try to link that with a framework to motivate families to do some desirable behaviors, and that has been very successful. I think it was also successful because governments began to face a major change in their own environment. Governments had set up in the 50s, the 60s, these big agencies that were involved in the distribution of the subsidies. And usually these agencies, for example, the main example may be agencies related to the cereal market. These agencies would distribute first subsidies to farmers in the form of guaranteed prices, and then they would have, all the corn in the country, and they would have to redistribute it to families and to corporations that manufacture food. And it was a difficult problem. And when free trade begins to advance with globalization after the 80s, the 90s, it became very difficult for governments to keep those big grain monopolies. And these cash transfer programs, I think, brought together two very powerful ideas. One is that people prefer to get some money than some goods from the government. And the other one is that the government could move to an environment of more control of how much money flows and who gets the benefit. I think when you look at it from that point of view, you also can understand why these programs have not been successful in growing, at least growing successfully beyond the very poor rural areas. Because these programs work very well in small, more isolated towns. For example, in Mexico, if you go to places like Chiapas, Oaxaca, where you have really towns that are far from cities, far from the regular movement of the mainstream of society, let's call it, where unfortunately you go to a small town and essentially everyone is poor. You always have a few guys that do some trading and bring things to buy and sell, and they may be wealthy, but overall the population is poor. Those programs are very successful there. When you move to big cities, it becomes difficult. I mean, the things Mayor Daley was talking about, in a city, you have a community, you have rich and poor people. It's very difficult to distinguish them. It's very difficult to distinguish them, and the moral hazard problem becomes very large to apply these programs in large cities. Now, briefly, we move on to employment programs. Here you have another case of governments trying to redistribute, finding out that they have significant constraints to apply, let's call them a traditional program, and now we're having a different solution in the region. And a traditional unemployment program is, well, like the program you have in the US, employers pay into a fund, and there's a public employment agency, and if someone is unemployed, they ask for a benefit, and they receive the benefit. That's it. And that's the way it works also in Europe in general. In Latin America, it's very difficult to establish those programs because the informal economy is so large. So countries that have these programs, like, for example, Brazil has one, Argentina has one, they have very low benefit levels. Because, again, the moral hazard problem is huge. You know, the typical problem in unemployment is, how do you know that this person is looking for a job? How do you know he really needs a job? So those programs have not been progressing in Latin America, even when many countries have expressed desires to have them. And really, what we see is that countries have been establishing mechanisms of forced savings. And some countries did it some time ago as part of pension reform. Brazil actually had something like this since the 60s. And recently, Chile established recently, I mean 10 years ago, they established unemployment insurance, but it's very different from, say, American or European unemployment insurance because it's basically a forced savings mechanism. And if a person is unemployed after paying into the fund, there's no public fund. They get benefits from their own money. So many people say, well, that's not unemployment insurance. Well, it has worked. There are evaluations. The government in Chile, for example, has a small public fund to support low-income workers that contribute many periods into their own account, and even then they don't have enough money to receive a decent benefit when unemployed. There's a public fund for that, but most of the money comes from individual accounts for unemployment. And now there's a bill in the Congress in Colombia to do pretty much that. And in Mexico, the government says that they're going to do pretty much that. And it's a question. It's the type of unemployment is an issue in Latin America, but it's very difficult to have traditional unemployment insurance. And finally, we get to what is perhaps the biggest debate I don't know if in the whole region, but at least in Mexico, and I suppose it's going to be in many other countries in the next 10 years, which is the issue of fiscal structure. And here, I think there are two ideas had been very well established. that when governments try to deviate from them, they do not get good results, and then they have been going back. And one is to reduce the wage gap. The other one is to use more general consumption taxes. Now, this issue of the wage gap, it began to be popular around the world in the 70s and definitely by the 80s. For those of you who are not into this, basically, by wage gap, they mean the difference between the cost of a job for an employer and the cash taken by the worker. Okay, so for example, if an employer pays 100, and that includes the wage and the social security taxes and the income tax and whatever, and the worker takes 60, well, the wage gap is 40. Okay, what's the difference between the cost to the employer and the cost to the and the cash taken by the worker? And here, some governments began with very explicit policies to reduce this wage gap in the 80s. Obviously, in the U.S., the reform with Reagan and Feldstein and what they did in the 80s was very important in that. But also, countries like Sweden, for example, Sweden had a decrease in the payroll tax bigger than the Reagan cut in the 80s. So even countries with strong social states believe that you cannot have good job creation if you put too much taxes on labor. And countries have been trying to contain the wage gap, to have better design of the income tax law, and then they are using the value-added tax more. And here I think we're going to have an interesting evolution for the future. Definitely countries like Mexico, like Chile, I have here Korea. I'd call this, I mean, being a little lax with the language, but I call this the free trade agreement countries. They have lower payroll taxes. And they also have lower value-added taxes. They have lower taxes overall. For example, in this table, you see that Brazil, of the countries that I pointed out here, Brazil has the highest payroll taxes of all this group, even higher than the United States. And that's because Brazil pays 10% of GDP in pensions. They spend like Belgium. In Brazil, half of the people begins to receive a pension benefit by age 55. And again, I began this presentation saying that economies have no relative advantage on ethical issues. So I'm not saying it's right or wrong. But Brazil needs very high taxes to keep those benefits. So it's a big debate in Brazil. It's going to be bigger in the future. And it's interesting. It's not clear that I'm not sure taxes are going to come down even more because, on the other hand, you have these big deficit problems in many countries. Once you take into account Social Security, essentially all countries have big deficit in the Americas. And some of them, for example, Mexico, if you look at the traditional measurement of the deficit, Mexico is running a superávit or a small deficit for the last 10 or 15 years. If you look at, except during the recession, but if you look at the Social Security deficit, Mexico has a big deficit. Same the US, same Canada, same Cuba, same anyone. So there's a question of what's going to happen here. Is the United States going to adopt a value-added tax? So I'm thinking about this discussion of what ideas are successful. The value-added tax has been very successful around the world. I'd say basically all of Latin America, all of Europe, and for what I can see, most of Asia. I do not know much about Asia, but the value-added tax has been the way to improve government revenues. And well, I'm not going to get into that discussion, but it's a good way or a better way than the payroll tax to finance the pension system and health insurance. But well, I'm going to leave it there. Now, I'm going to finish saying that I think this Stigler approach is useful. I think it's good to think about why some ideas are successful, why some are not. He made the point that if we define the ethical issues as the only issues to evaluate and decide on policy, we may not have a good motivation or a good positive theory of income distribution and how policy affects income distribution. That certainly does not mean that ethical issues are not important. It doesn't even mean that they are secondary. I think for almost anyone, ethical issues are foremost, and they are the main issues. And people is in politics, and people do many things because there's altruism, and people has ethical values. Now, but they don't provide us positive theories of income distribution. And I believe that we have to think about, just to finish, I'd say about the pension reform. You still go to many forums like this in Latin America. People still debating the Chilean reform that happened 30 years ago. And they're still discussing the issue of pension reform in terms of whether there was a dictatorship and whether it's private to public, and whether it's ethical to have a private industry in the pension system. And well, I think those discussions are missing one basic point. And the basic point is that governments need to decentralize part of the pension system, that having some competition in the annuities market has been good. And that's why even countries with very strong social states have moved to that. And I think we have to do that in each of these areas. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. We are going to have a chance to ask questions. I'm sure that you want to ask Gabriel many things, but I have an advantage because they sat me on this side, so I'm the one starting here for a few minutes, and then I open to the floor. When I think of social protection, I think of two different areas. One, insurance, the management of risk, and there is where I see the pensions and health insurance, that type of issues. The other one is social assistance. So the orphan, the poor, the needy, and there are many gray areas. And I think in the last, say, 20 years, we have been increasing in some Latin American countries the gray areas. There are pensions for old age nowadays that have nothing to do with your past working history or contributions you may have. At the same time, as you mentioned, we have this very large informal sector. Our informal labor markets are tremendously large, and they are not being reduced in most cases, right? So I'm very keen to hear what is your view about where are we going. We are going towards this type of social insurance that works as insurance or is more assistance. Can we sustain this? Are these reforms that we have seen in some Latin American countries a once and for all type of thing? And then just your comments, your view on that. Where do you see us going?
No, well, I think this traditional separation between social assistance and social security is not a good way to go. I think originally perhaps the idea when they founded Social Security in the region, the idea was that the labor market was going to become something like the European markets. That has not been the case. But I think up to maybe the 60s, the 70s, that was still a prevalent idea. And it has not happened. I'd say it's one of the ideas that failed. To have a social insurance of the European type is something that really has not happened. I believe that American societies, for good or bad, are much more heterogeneous than the European. And that applies not only to Latin America and the Caribbean, it applies also to the United States. And that makes it very difficult to have European type programs. And that's why I believe also that a more decentralized approach has been more successful in the region. Now, I believe in some areas we have very significant advances. I think that, for example, things take time to mature, but I think Chile is the example. I think the pension system has been very successful. They had the last reform they had is 2005, 2006, I believe. They were very successful in integrating the whole system into one, and that's good because they also had the public assistance pensions and the social security pensions, and now they have only one system, and that's very good. Uruguay also has moved to that. I think those countries have now a much better framework to advance. At the end, you want, for example, mobility of people. Maybe a kid was born in a poor family and he began on some sort of benefit. But what you like is that he should be able to progress through the system, let's say it seamlessly. That would be the idea, that he could move to a job with Social Security and just see it as a natural progression. And the other way around also, perhaps you have a man who had a regular job for many years and he is going to be 60, he divorces, he loses whatever, and he ends up poor, and you don't want him to fall into indigence for that. So I think to have an integrated system is very important, and it's complicated. In my experience, when one talks about these things, sometimes people say, well, but you're talking about Chile and Uruguay. Well, come on. I mean, there are others that could have done it and haven't done it. And then you also see things like Brazil, for example. I like it. One thing they are doing, they made this big reform to widen social expenditures. Mm-hmm. And well, they have been dealing with it, and actually I think the system is stable, and I don't see a reason to cut it just for fiscal reasons. But one thing that is happening in Brazil now is that they're becoming part of a movement to integrate all services received by a citizen through one agency. Mm-hmm. And for example, the Canadians have done that. Perhaps if you check it in the web, just type Service Canada, Service Ontario, Service Quebec, and you're going to see something that is very interesting and that you don't have in the United States. And we don't have it in Mexico, but Uruguay began to do it. They began to work on that a long time ago, maybe 15 years ago. Chile began like 4 or 5 years ago with that. Canada is one of the world leaders in that. But to develop, to design agencies around the person and not around the programs. Okay, so you want a person to receive the full, all sort of social services through an integrated, let's call it, I wouldn't call it a package, to an integrated system. And it takes time, it takes vision, it takes, I would coincide with the views of the majors. It takes a view of community to do that. But just to give you a brief example. In Canada, they get, just for living there, you get a very small pension. And then it's all a contributory system. And the government's saving money for that. And actually most of the money, as in the US, is going to come from private pensions. But it's a single system. It's not two systems. It's one. And Chile is doing it now. It's not two systems. It's one system. I think that would be a great step in other countries.
You see some political willingness to move towards that type of system?
Well, yeah, the idea is very good. So people hear about this and they like it. Obviously, the issues you have is, for example, the design of taxes has to be done to serve that purpose. And the agencies, you have to change the agencies. That's one of the big issues. I think one thing you see, across Latin America, and it has to do with one of the ideas I commented. These programs of the type of cash transfer programs, the idea was very successful. But let me tell you something else that happened. And perhaps there are a few exceptions, but in general what happened is that governments created new agencies for those programs. And those agencies are controlled by the president. Okay? Mm-hmm. So it's politics 101. So you would think, well, why haven't they merged that agency with Social Security? For example, in Mexico now there's a debate. We have a new government, so people... But let me tell you something that... It would sound funny if it weren't right, but the government of Mexico City gives pensions with money from the city. And the federal government gives pensions with money from the federal government. And now they have offices in the city, both have offices in the city, to give pensions to the same people. And it's the wealthiest city in the country. You know, many upper middle class people gets this. And they believe that they have to have those agencies as part of their political machines. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, you know, it's one idea that is very good, but it has to struggle. The idea has to struggle with all those oppositions.
Yeah, we're not so good at organizing institutions. I just received a pile of questions here, so I had a few more for you, but I'm going to move to these ones, and then if we have time, I keep on going. Of course, this could not fail, you being from Mexico. Somebody's asking if Mexico should continue with the program Oportunidades, because we see that the poverty is not decreasing in the country. So what is your opinion about that?
Well, Oportunidades is the cash transfer program in Mexico, and it has been very successful. So I have no question it's going to continue. Well, if you know Mexico, or if you are from a place like Bolivia or Guatemala, maybe you have been in those places. But in Mexico, some towns are very, very, very poor. You know, they're really hungry, and really, you really need some support from the outside to bring them out. I think so. Oportunidades has been very successful to the extent it goes to those towns, because also, you know, I think it was very useful for the government to overcome these bureaucratic barriers that the mayor was also talking about, the mayor of Curitiba. You know, you have the education ministry and the social ministry and the health ministry, and they work separately. And Oportunidades has forced them to work together.
Right. Okay. Back to the pension system. Many countries, not only in South America, face problems in private pension systems, is statement here. When private funds underperform, it is the fault of the government. Governments are forced to conduct unpopular reforms to alleviate the burden, and are often criticized, even though it is private market that has failed in the first place. I'm not sure what is the question, but I guess it's like, what is your comment about that?
No, well, I believe that these movements for a more decentralized pension system have to come with a much stronger regulation of the pension funds. And yes, it has been a problem well, in 2008, for example, the California pension fund, the Quebec pension fund, they lost a lot of money. In Latin America, the pension funds of the fund managers in Mexico, in Chile, they lost quite a bit of money. And we have to distinguish the issue of when they lose money because of just this business cycle. And well, that's unavoidable. And regulation just have to be careful of caring for the interest of the citizens and avoid excessive risk. And also, what I have to say, in the current context, governments, I believe, have to do much more on financial regulation. I mean, in 2008, it became obvious that there are lots of crooks around, and really, the monetary system, the financial system, has to be regulated very strongly. I only say briefly, given that we have so many students here. For example, on the first point, I'd say, we have all this literature on psychology and economics. Well, Professor Rosales is here I think it's at the business school or the economics. I think it's at the business school. Business. Sunstein and Obama were here, and they tried to push some of those ideas in the U.S. government. There are things to do. To decentralize the pension system doesn't mean it's a Wild West system. It has to be a very regulated system. And on financial regulation, well, it's also a big debate. And definitely, pension systems have to be one of the most regulated parts of the financial system, because they affect welfare so much. You don't want to know when you are 65 and you are ready to retire. You don't want to know that the market fell and that you have to wait 5 or 10 years more. Or if your husband died and you have to retire your money now, you don't want to wait for the market to recover. So you need quite a bit of regulation to protect those risks.
Is your idea you would still keep the private sector as an important player in this?
Well, I'd say that I put it as an idea that has progressed. And I think that the basic idea is that you can have the state guarantee of income. That's one thing that is public and that where governments cannot be eliminated or separated. But then you have all the issue of fund management, where I'd say it's not so much that I believe it's good. I think the movement towards private funds is huge. For example, Brazil never had a reform of the Chilean type.
Right.
Say among the large countries in the Americas, Brazil is the only one that didn't have a big reform. The Canadians have it. Well, the Americans had it in the sense I mentioned. Brazil didn't. But still, let me tell you, Brazil's private pension funds are collecting something like $20 billion a month. The private pension system in Brazil is very large. And well, the government has responded issuing regulations. There's an office in Brasilia that regulates the pension funds from the financial point of view. And they have also changed the tax laws to make them compatible with Social Security and other forms of savings. So Brazil is doing that, even when they haven't had a reform. Just I'm going to put it this simply. The pension funds in Brazil are the biggest in Latin America, even when they haven't had a reform. And that's why that idea is going to be sustained.
Thanks. There is a question here about how should governments deal with the fragmentation in the labor market into formal and informal sectors to produce universal social insurance?
Yeah. Well, that's a very important question. So let me give you an example of. I was recently at a meeting of social security agencies from different countries, whatever, and there was a presentation from a man from Belgium. It's not supposed to be. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world with a very strong welfare state. If you ask people, if you check the statistics, they're going to tell you that Belgium has a 100% coverage of Social Security since, I don't know when, the 50s or 60s, no question about it. But let me tell you what they did. They came out with a program, they call it the voucher program. And these are not like the Friedman vouchers. They are vouchers, let's say, the other way around. But employers can hire domestic aid, they can hire people to provide services at home, or small firms hire workers, and they can go buy a voucher, and they give the voucher to the worker, and then the worker goes with Social Security, and that counts, okay? It counts for your pension, for your health insurance, and that. They began with that in 2005, 2006. Now they have about 800,000 people using the vouchers. And that's Belgium, the country with no informal economy. So the truth is that Belgium discovered through this program that they had 20% of the population that was receiving social benefits in some way, but were not paying into the funds, even when they were willing to pay, because they are not sending the police or auditors to collect this money. It's just a different way to organize the system using IT, whatever, and they have had this big improvement. And I believe this issue of the informal economy is really, in a sense, it's very deep, but you can do a lot with administrative solutions, with good management. I think Latin American agencies can do a lot. I actually believe that what we've seen, for example, in Chile or Uruguay, in terms of reducing informality, it has to do more with improved administration than with the design of the tax laws and whatever. I think that the success in Canada, they had a big health and big pension reform. But I think the success in Canada comes more from improved administration than from all those tax and benefit reforms.
Thanks. Gabriel, somebody's wondering here, what should be the role of the labor institutions and job security provision? How we facilitate job creation at the same time we are protecting the workers? So how we manage incentives to work?
Well, I'd say in Latin America, I don't know if we're coming out, but I think there was I call it an identity crisis of labor policy, of labor ministries. Because in many countries, I guess in most, if not in all countries, the role of the Secretary of Labor was to a large extent to oversee collective bargaining, to keep the peace in the workplace. But they really, unfortunately, labor ministries in Latin America do not have good expertise on issues of health and safety, strong training programs. And I think that they have been coming out the last, let's say, 10 years. You have improved labor market programs. They are thinking more about how to develop the skills of the labor force, having better unemployment protection. But it's a long process. I think that's going to take still time to go. And well, the debate on jobs is not easy. I mean, from the graphs I show, and I'm going to be very simplistic, but basically free trade countries in Latin America have been very successful in creating jobs. Mexico, unemployment is not an issue in Mexico. It's easy to get jobs. And if you go to cities like, I don't know, for example, Tijuana, the unemployment rate is 0.5%. Because if you don't work, it's because, you're really lazy or something like that. Wages are very low. So it's not clear that just because you get lots of job creation, you are doing well. Productivity, well, I said something about it. I don't know, I think it's a long process. It's not easy. I don't think economists have a good idea of how to increase productivity or what determines productivity. I really still used to say that those questions of productivity and wealth creation are the most difficult. And he would talk about all these issues on how to create ideas. And he would say, well, some people has a martini after lunch and they do great. And who knows? But achieving productivity in Latin America has not been easy. And in Mexico in particular, results are pretty bad for the last 20 years.
Thanks. Somebody's moving you to Venezuela. Do you have any opinion about Social Security in Venezuela? What is the Chavez legacy, and is successful or is not?
Well, I really don't know much about Venezuela. They have a Social Security Institute. Let's call it a traditional Social Security Institute that they collect a payroll tax and then they give benefits. They have very low coverage, maybe 20%. I really have not studied the issue in detail. I know they tried in the Chavez years some reforms, some new laws. I'm really not sure how much that advanced. So I really couldn't tell.
We still have 5 minutes? Okay. Talking about taxes, you comment that there were very high taxes to consumption, and I think that's definitely true. We have several countries that are around 20%, yes. Argentina a little bit more than that, Brazil is like 19%. I also see that the European countries have, so consumption taxes seem to be winning the war here. And somebody in the audience is asking about tax reforms and how we can create efficient redistribution if we cannot create these good tax reforms that we need. The statement is that the area still suffers from high level of corruption and, governments control most of the revenue, of course. They put the example of Venezuela again, that we don't need to get into particular countries, but in general, how you see we can move to efficient tax reforms that would be, able to sustain this type of social insurance or protection that we want to achieve.
Well, I think definitely the national governments are going to need more revenue because the deficit of pension programs and the pressures on health insurance are so big. And I think the basic ideas are more or less accepted. Obviously, I want to say that everyone agrees, but I think in general people believe that the value-added taxes plays a big role. The Europeans have very high taxes. South America has very high VATs. The U.S. does not have a national sales tax, and that means that Canada and Mexico and the Caribbean cannot have high consumption taxes because, the response of imports, exports, even smuggling is so fast. But if the U.S. moves to a general consumption tax, and that's a big if, that's a very, very big if, I think we're going to see even bigger consumption taxes around the world. I don't know. The other idea is that you can improve the design of the income tax, and I think that's going to go on. And I believe it's also more an administrative issue than an issue of having a big economist doing a design of the table in the tax law. And I say this because there was another idea that was very big in the 80s, the 90s, and it comes out in every election in Mexico, in the US, I don't know if in other countries, which is the flat tax. And the flat tax has been a flat idea. It really has not worked out. It's a very popular idea, and somehow when governments try to advance on that, they really don't get the first base. For some reason, it doesn't work. And what has been working out is that if you have a good design of the income tax, a good design of your social programs, then you get into a constructive path. And I'd mention of the countries I had in the list, I'd say, for example, Korea. Korea is an interesting case because Korea used to be, at least from what I see, that is very little, a sort of Latin American country. They had a huge informal economy, low productivity, very unequal distribution of income, political problems, some dictatorship, and they have been very successful in terms of increasing productivity. They have reduced informality, but they still have substantial informality. In Korea, maybe 20% of the workers are informal. They call it, they give a different name to informal workers there, but they still have that. And they have been working very hard in doing that, in improving the income tax laws. They have a VAT. Obviously, they are not closed from the US, so they don't have smuggling. And Korea has been very successful in improving tax revenues. And most of tax revenues go to the welfare state because they have universal health insurance, but it's not Spanish or French health insurance. The Koreans have universal health insurance, but half of the money comes from private pockets. Okay, so you have your insurance, but you have to chip in a lot of money in deductibles and co-payments and whatnot. And they have a universal pension system. But the minimum pension in Korea is, I don't remember the exact number, but it's like 20% of the minimum wage. It's very low. So even when you look at these very successful countries, it takes time. I really don't think there's going to be something like a tax reform and then the government gets a bunch of money to spend. That's not going to happen.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, everyone. I think to keep on schedule, we have to finish here, but maybe there is a chance to chat a little bit over lunch and later in the day. Thank you. And join me to thank Gabriel.